In 1973, Ford Motor Company sat down with a calculator and figured out that a human life was worth $200,000. Then they figured out that fixing a known deadly design flaw would cost $11 per car. And then they decided it was cheaper to let people burn. That is not an exaggeration. That is a real document, and the car it was written about is just one of the machines on this list. Let's start with the car that changed everything. Number 5, the Chevrolet Corvair. In 1959, General Motors did something genuinely bold. They designed a rear-engined, air-cooled compact car with an aluminum flat six and fully independent suspension. It was unlike anything America had ever built. It was supposed to compete with the Volkswagen Beetle, and on paper, it was better in every way. More power, more space, more American. Chevrolet sold nearly 200,000 Corvairs a year in the early 1960s. It won awards. It looked fantastic. There was just one problem. The early Corvairs, the 1960 through 1963 models, used a swing-axle rear suspension that could cause the rear wheels to tuck under during hard cornering. With over 60% of the car's weight sitting over the back axle, this created a pendulum effect. Go into a corner too fast, and the heavy rear end would start to swing out. As the car pushed sideways, the suspension would jack up, lifting the rear wheels off the ground. In severe cases, the car would simply roll over. General Motors' own engineers knew about it. A mechanic named George Caramagna suggested installing a front anti-roll bar to stabilize the handling. It would have cost a few dollars per car. Management overruled him to save money. Instead, they specified wildly unconventional tire pressures, 15 pounds per square inch in the front and 26 pounds per square inch in the rear. Most owners, and even most mechanics, had no idea they were supposed to maintain those pressures. If you inflated your Corvair's tires the same way you inflated every other car on the road, you were driving a potential death trap. In 1965, a young lawyer named Ralph Nader published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. The first chapter was called The Sporty Corvair, The One-Car Accident. The book became a national bestseller. General Motors responded by hiring private investigators to follow Nader and dig up dirt on his personal life. When that became public, it only made things worse. Here's the twist. By the time Nader's book came out, General Motors had already redesigned the Corvair with a fully independent rear suspension that eliminated the problem. But the damage was done. Sales collapsed from nearly 250,000 in 1965 to just 14,000 by 1968. And a 1972 government study actually concluded that the early Corvair was no more dangerous than comparable cars of its era. But nobody cared. The Corvair was dead, and its real legacy was not the car itself. It was the creation of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the beginning of the modern automotive safety era. Number 4, the Ford Pinto. If the Corvair started the conversation about automotive safety, the Pinto turned it into a national scandal. In 1971, Ford President Lee Iacocca wanted a subcompact car that weighed under 2,000 pounds and cost under $2,000 to compete with Japanese imports. The car was rushed from concept to production in just 25 months, roughly half the normal development cycle. That rush would prove fatal. During pre-production crash testing, Ford engineers discovered that the Pinto's fuel tank, mounted just a few inches in front of the rear bumper and only 3 inches behind the rear axle, would rupture in rear-end collisions at speeds as low as 20 miles per hour. Bolts from the rear differential would puncture the thin-walled tank, spraying fuel everywhere. Worse, the doors often jammed after impact, trapping occupants inside as the car caught fire. Ford knew, and they did the math. A 1973 internal document, which became known as the Pinto Memo, laid out a cost-benefit analysis that would become the most infamous in corporate history. Fixing the fuel tank with a protective shield or reinforced bladder would cost approximately $11 per vehicle. Across 12.5 million vehicles, that was $137 million. Ford estimated the fires would cause about 180 deaths per year, and using the government's own figure, they valued each life at $200,000. The total cost of not fixing the problem was $49.5 million. The math said it was cheaper to let people burn than to spend $11 per car. In 1977, Mother Jones magazine published an exposé called Pinto Madness that brought the memo to national attention. In 1978, an Indiana grand jury made Ford the first American corporation ever charged with criminal homicide. Ford was acquitted at trial, but the civil lawsuits were devastating. One California jury awarded $128 million to a single victim. Ford finally recalled 1.5 million Pintos in 1978, 7 years after the problem was first identified. The Pinto is remembered as the car where Detroit put a price tag on human life and decided it was not worth the investment. And for this audience in particular, it is worth remembering that the same Lee Iacocca who pushed the Mustang to greatness also pushed the Pinto to production before it was safe. Number 3. The Chevrolet Vega. If the Pinto was Ford's shame, the Vega was General Motors' humiliation. The Vega was supposed to be General Motors' answer to Japanese imports. It debuted in 1970 with an innovative aluminum block 4-cylinder engine, modern styling that looked like a shrunken Camaro, and a price tag designed to undercut the Toyota Corolla. Motor Trend named it Car of the Year for 1971. Then people started driving them. The Vega's engine was an engineering disaster. General Motors President Ed Cole had personally championed a revolutionary sleeveless aluminum block using a silicon aluminum alloy. The concept was sound and would eventually be perfected by Mercedes and Porsche. But Cole rushed development and cut critical corners. To save roughly $8 per engine, General Motors skipped conventional iron cylinder liners. They bolted a cast iron head onto the aluminum block, two metals with completely different expansion rates. The cooling system was woefully undersized, with a radiator barely 1 foot square. General Motors' own engineers privately called it the world's tallest, smallest engine. In practice, the engine would overheat. When it overheated, the aluminum block and iron head would expand at different rates, warping the head gasket seal. Coolant would leak into the cylinders, scoring the unlined aluminum bores. Without sleeves, the damage was fatal to the engine. Meanwhile, faulty valve stem seals caused massive oil consumption. Many Vega engines burned nearly as much oil as gasoline. A test mule reportedly disintegrated during evaluation on General Motors' proving grounds, and management greenlit production anyway. By 1972, General Motors had recalled nearly 500,000 Vegas for defects ranging from separating rear axle shafts to carburetors that could cause engine fires. By the Vega's third recall, 95% of all Vegas built before May 1972 had been flagged for critical safety flaws. The car rusted so fast that body panels would develop holes within 2 or 3 years. The Vega became a symbol of everything wrong with Detroit in the 1970s and convinced an entire generation of buyers that American companies could not build a reliable small car. That reputation haunted General Motors for decades. Number 2. The Dodge Aspen and Plymouth Volare. Most people remember the Pinto and the Vega. Far fewer remember the car that holds the actual record for the most recalled American automobile ever built. The Dodge Aspen and its Plymouth twin, the Volare, launched in 1976 as replacements for the venerable Dart and Valiant. Chrysler desperately needed a hit. What they got was a rolling recall notice. Within the first year of production, the Aspen and Volare were recalled 6 times. The problems ranged from hoods that could fly open at highway speed, to engines that stalled, to premature rust so aggressive that fenders would literally separate from the body within months of purchase. The front fenders became such a notorious rust trap that replacement fenders became one of the most commonly ordered parts in Chrysler's system. But the most dangerous defect was in the brakes. Premature brake wear and sudden brake fade were reported across multiple model years. Chrysler also discovered that the carburetor could hesitate during acceleration, causing the car to lurch unpredictably in traffic. Over the course of their production run, the Aspen and Volare accumulated over 4.4 million individual recall notices. That is not a typo. That number far exceeds the roughly 2.5 million units these cars sold. Some individual cars were recalled 7 or 8 separate times. The Aspen and Volare did not kill people in the dramatic headline-grabbing way the Pinto did. They just quietly fell apart, brake by brake, fender by fender, until their owners gave up and bought a Toyota. Number 1. The AMC Gremlin. American Motors Corporation was always the underdog. They didn't have GM's money, Ford's engineering depth, or Chrysler's dealer network. And in 1970, when they needed to compete against the imports, they did what AMC always did. They grabbed whatever was lying around and made it work on a shoestring budget. The Gremlin was literally a Hornet with the back end chopped off. Designers sliced roughly 15 inches off the rear of the car and called it done. The result looked exactly like what it was, a car that had been cut in half. The truncated rear end created a massive blind spot over the driver's right shoulder. The shortened wheelbase made the car twitchy and unpredictable at highway speeds. The rear hatch was so close to the rear axle that the cargo area was almost useless, but the real danger was structural. By removing all that rear bodywork, AMC dramatically reduced the car's rear crush zone. In a rear-end collision, there was almost nothing between the back bumper and the fuel tank. Sound familiar? The Gremlin shared the Pinto's fundamental vulnerability, a fuel tank exposed to rear impact damage, but without the media attention that eventually forced Ford to act. AMC simply did not sell enough Gremlins for the problem to generate the same level of outrage. The Gremlin also suffered from appalling build quality, door latches that would pop open during cornering, rust that could eat through floor panels in a single winter, an inline six that was reliable enough, but was paired with a chassis that was not engineered to handle its weight distribution. AMC sold nearly 700,000 Gremlins between 1970 and 1978, and the car did exactly what it was designed to do. It gave budget-conscious Americans a cheap alternative to imports. It just did so while quietly putting them at risk every time they got behind the wheel. Here's the common thread running through every car on this list. In every single case, the engineers knew. They saw the flaws in testing. They proposed fixes. And in every single case, management decided that the cost of doing it right was higher than the cost of getting it wrong. The Corvair needed a stabilizer bar. The Pinto needed an $11 fuel tank shield. The Vega needed iron cylinder liners. The Aspen needed another 6 months of development. The Gremlin needed a longer rear end. None of these were exotic solutions. They were basic engineering, sacrificed at the altar of cost-cutting and production deadlines. It took Ralph Nader, the NHTSA, landmark lawsuits, and a generation of burned, injured, and disillusioned American car buyers to force Detroit to finally take safety seriously. And it is no coincidence that the rise of Japanese imports in the 1970s and the 1980s happened at exactly the same time Americans started to realize that the cars they were buying from Detroit might be trying to kill them. What do you think? Did I miss a car that should have made this list? Which one of these was the most unforgivable? Drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.